The record introduces the Nephilim briefly, almost without explanation, yet their presence lingers across centuries of interpretation and unease. They appear at the threshold of catastrophe, named just before the world is judged and remade, and then vanish as quickly as they are mentioned. What remains is a word, a silence, and a long history of debate shaped by scribes, translators, kings, and scholars who inherited the question but not the certainty. The Nephilim matter not because they dominate the text, but because they disrupt it. They sit at the intersection of genealogy and transgression, of heaven and earth, of rule and violence. Ancient readers did not encounter them as a curiosity, but as a sign that something in the established order had been crossed, altered, or corrupted. Yet the sources disagree on how this crossing occurred, and even on what kind of beings the Nephilim were understood to be. This documentary proceeds carefully through those sources. It follows how the record preserves fragments rather than conclusions, and how each generation attempted to situate the Nephilim within its own understanding of authority, lineage, and divine order. What emerges is not a single answer, but a layered historical problem that refuses to settle quietly. The primeval narrative of Genesis introduces the Nephilim with notable restraint. They appear in a narrow span of verses, without lineage, speech, or action attributed directly to them. The record does not pause to explain who they are, where they come from, or what role they play. Instead, their name is embedded within a transitional passage that moves the narrative from the spread of human life toward the declaration of divine judgment. The placement is precise. It is not at the beginning of human history, nor at its destruction, but in the quiet space where order is said to be failing. The text situates this moment during a period of expansion. Humanity is described as increasing upon the face of the ground. Daughters are born, and boundaries that had previously remained untested begin to blur. Within this setting, the Nephilim are named once, without elaboration, as if the reader is expected to recognize the term. The narrative does not introduce them with markers of novelty. There is no formula of explanation, no interruption in the flow of events. This literary economy is itself a concrete feature of the passage, suggesting intentional compression rather than omission. Ancient scribal practice provides an early anchor for understanding this restraint. The Genesis account bears the marks of careful transmission, preserving words whose meanings may not have been immediately transparent to later audiences. In this case, the term Nephilim is neither translated nor replaced. It is carried forward intact, even as surrounding phrases are rendered with clarity. This preservation indicates that the scribes responsible for copying the text did not see their role as explanatory. Their task was to transmit the record as it had been received, including its silences. The immediate literary environment reinforces this approach. The passage is framed by observations about human behavior and divine response. The focus remains on the condition of the world rather than on individual figures within it. Violence, corruption, and the spread of disorder are named broadly, without attribution to specific agents. The Nephilim are mentioned within this atmosphere, but not identified as its cause. The record resists assigning them narrative responsibility, leaving their significance implicit rather than argued. This compression is unusual within the broader structure of Genesis, where genealogies and origins are typically detailed. Names are often followed by lists, ages, and relationships. Even marginal figures receive placement within family lines. The Nephilim stand apart from this pattern. Their lack of genealogy is not accidental. It positions them outside the normal mechanisms by which identity and legitimacy are established in the text. In a narrative deeply concerned with descent and inheritance, this absence carries weight. The spatial setting of the passage offers another anchor. The events are described as occurring upon the earth, a phrase that recurs throughout the primeval history. This language emphasizes visibility and shared space rather than hidden realms. The Nephilim are not introduced as distant or inaccessible beings. They belong to the same world that humanity inhabits, yet they are not integrated into its structures. The record places them alongside human multiplication, but does not merge their identity with it. The narrative voice remains observational. It does not interrupt to interpret the appearance of the Nephilim, nor does it signal surprise. This tone suggests that the presence of such figures was not presented as unprecedented within the conceptual world of the text. The lack of commentary may reflect an assumption that the earliest audience possessed a framework for understanding the term. Over time, as that framework faded, the word remained, increasingly opaque to readers who encountered it without the context once assumed. The transition from this passage to the declaration of divine judgment is measured rather than abrupt. The text does not claim that the Nephilim provoke the judgment directly. Instead, it observes a cumulative condition. The inclination of human thought is described as continually inclined toward disorder. The Nephilim remain part of the environment in which this condition develops, but they are not isolated as its origin. This narrative choice resists simplification. It preserves complexity by refusing to assign singular blame. Within ancient textual traditions, such restraint often signals gravity rather than uncertainty. The record speaks briefly when it assumes weight rather than clarity. By naming the Nephilim without elaboration, the text acknowledges their presence while declining to resolve their meaning. This approach transforms the term into a marker rather than a description. It points to a reality the narrative does not fully unfold, leaving later readers to confront the gap. The physical layout of the passage in early manuscripts reinforces this effect. The verses containing the Nephilim are not set apart visually. They do not receive headings or marginal notes in the earliest traditions. They exist as part of a continuous account, easily passed over if read quickly. Yet their very subtlety has ensured their endurance as a subject of attention. What is briefly stated becomes difficult to ignore precisely because it is not explained. This first appearance establishes the Nephilim as a problem of record rather than of imagination. The text does not invite speculation. It merely preserves a name within a moment of transition. The silence surrounding that name becomes part of its function. It signals that something is present in the world that does not require introduction, yet does not submit to categorization. As the narrative continues toward judgment, the focus shifts away from individual figures to the state of creation as a whole. The Nephilim do not reappear. They leave no trace in the unfolding events beyond their initial mention. This disappearance is as deliberate as their introduction. It reinforces the sense that their role is contextual rather than narrative. They belong to a condition, not a storyline. By the end of this passage, the reader is left with a term preserved and a question unaddressed. The record has moved on, but the name remains embedded within it, waiting for interpretation that the text itself does not provide. The narrative pause here is quiet, not unresolved in tone, but open in implication. The silence surrounding the Nephilim in the primeval record does not indicate neglect. Rather, it reflects a deliberate narrative posture that prioritizes condition over explanation. As the account moves forward, attention settles increasingly on the moral and structural state of the world. The text observes the spread of disorder as a collective phenomenon, not a sequence of isolated transgressions. Within this framework, the Nephilim function as a sign embedded in the environment, not as actors directing events. This narrative economy aligns with the broader method of the primeval history. Early Genesis frequently compresses long spans of time and complex developments into brief statements. Generations pass in a line. Cities are founded in a phrase. cultural practices emerge without elaboration. The appearance of the Nephilim belongs to this same mode of presentation. They are named as part of the landscape of a world approaching judgment, not as a story requiring resolution. A key anchor lies in the way the passage balances visibility and obscurity. The Nephilim are not hidden beings. They are said to be on the earth, a phrase repeated to emphasize presence within the human sphere, yet their nature is left undefined. This combination suggests that the record is less concerned with what they are than with the fact that they are there. Their presence contributes to the sense that the boundaries governing the world are no longer clearly maintained. The language surrounding the passage reinforces this impression. Verbs describing human action emphasize multiplication, taking, and choosing. These are not inherently negative actions, but they are presented without restraint or discernment. The narrative does not isolate a single moment of failure. Instead, it portrays a gradual erosion of limits. The Nephilim are introduced within this context, neither praised nor condemned, but associated with a world in which distinctions are increasingly blurred. The absence of narrative action attributed to the Nephilim is especially notable. They do not build, speak, rule, or rebel within the text. This omission resists the creation of a mythic storyline centered on their deeds. Instead, the record allows them to exist as a category whose significance is implied rather than demonstrated. Their name carries weight without being activated through plot. From a textual standpoint, this restraint serves a stabilizing function. By refusing to elaborate, the narrative avoids diverting attention from its primary concern, the assessment of the world's condition. The judgment that follows is framed as a response to pervasive corruption, not to a single extraordinary cause. The Nephilim are part of the picture, but not its explanation. Ancient readers encountering this passage would have approached it differently than later audiences. For those closer to the text's composition, the term Nephilim may have belonged to a shared vocabulary of memory or tradition. The narrative does not pause to define familiar terms. Over time, as that shared framework receded, the preserved word became increasingly isolated. What was once assumed became obscure, not because the text changed, but because the audience did. This shift in audience understanding transforms the function of the passage. For later readers, the Nephilim become a focal point precisely because they are not explained. The brevity that once signaled familiarity begins to generate uncertainty. The record, however, does not adapt to this change. It remains fixed in its original posture, preserving both the name and the silence that surrounds it. Another anchor appears in the transition to divine response. The narrative does not single out the Nephilim when describing the assessment of humanity. The language broadens, encompassing thought, intention, and inclination. The judgment addresses the entirety of human activity. This universal framing reinforces the idea that the Nephilim are contextual rather than causal. They belong to the environment being judged, not to the rationale for judgment itself. The structure of the passage also resists retrospective explanation. Later sections of Genesis do not return to clarify the identity of the Nephilim. No genealogical corrections are offered. No interpretive gloss is inserted. This absence suggests that the compilers of the text did not view the ambiguity as a problem to be solved. The record preserves what it received, including its limits. Within the discipline of ancient historiography, such limits are significant. Texts often preserve fragments that point beyond themselves, acknowledging realities that cannot be fully contained within the narrative. The Nephilim serve this function. They mark the edge of explanation, where the record names but does not define. This practice reflects a commitment to transmission over interpretation. The effect of this approach is cumulative. As the narrative moves past the flood and into more structured histories, the primeval section stands apart as a compressed account of origins and breakdown. The Nephilim remain confined to this early phase, reinforcing their association with a world that no longer exists in the same form. Their disappearance from the narrative is not explained, but it is consistent with the broader transformation of the world described by the text. This containment is essential. By limiting the Nephilim to a brief appearance, the record prevents them from becoming a recurring explanatory device. They are not invoked to explain later conflicts or social conditions. Their role is bound to a specific moment of transition. This restraint preserves the integrity of the narrative's progression, allowing later histories to focus on institutions, covenants, and law. The primeval record, then, establishes a pattern that later interpreters will confront. A term is preserved without clarification. A presence is acknowledged without elaboration. The narrative moves forward without resolving the question it has raised. This pattern creates space for interpretation, but it does not invite it explicitly. The text remains neutral, neither endorsing speculation nor discouraging inquiry. As this chapter draws to a close, the Nephilim stand as a textual marker rather than a defined subject. Their significance lies in how they are introduced, not in what is said about them. The record presents them quietly, deliberately, and without explanation, embedding them within a moment of increasing disorder and impending judgment. This foundational restraint shapes everything that follows. Later generations will attempt to supply what the primeval narrative withholds, turning to lineage, authority, and cosmology to address the silence. But at this stage, the record remains unchanged. It names, preserves, and moves on, leaving the Nephilim where they first appear, present, unexplained, and firmly embedded in the earliest layer of the text. The phrase "sons of God" enters the primeval narrative without ceremony, yet it introduces a boundary whose significance is far-reaching. The record does not pause to define the term. Instead, it places it within a description of interaction, an act of seeing, taking, and joining, that occurs as human society expands across the earth. The language is spare, but the implications are precise. A category previously associated with the divine sphere is now depicted in direct relation to human life. In the ancient Near Eastern world, such language did not operate in abstraction. Courts, councils, and hierarchies structured both human governance and conceptions of the divine realm. Texts from surrounding cultures frequently describe assemblies of gods, ranked according to function and authority. Within this framework, "sons of God" was not a poetic phrase, but a term associated with service, status, and delegated responsibility. The Genesis narrative draws on this conceptual field without elaboration, assuming familiarity rather than explanation. The record presents these figures as observing humanity. The act of seeing is deliberate, not incidental. It implies awareness and assessment rather than chance encounter. What follows is an action that crosses a line. The taking of human wives is described without commentary, but its placement within the narrative suggests a disruption of established order. The concern is not relational intimacy, but jurisdiction. Those designated for a particular sphere have acted beyond it. Ancient audiences would have recognized the weight of such a movement. Boundaries between realms, divine and human, heavenly and earthly, were understood as essential to stability. Oversight required distance. Authority depended on separation. When those assigned to one domain acted within another, the result was not union but disorder. The Genesis account reflects this understanding by embedding the episode within a broader depiction of corruption rather than celebration. The language used does not frame the event as mythic romance. There is no description of affection, desire, or narrative exchange. The focus remains on action and consequence. This restraint signals that the issue at hand is structural rather than emotional. The sons of God are not portrayed as lovers, but as figures who abandon their designated role. The taking of wives becomes a symbol of overreach rather than relationship. A concrete anchor emerges in the way ancient texts describe divine service. In several traditions, heavenly beings are assigned tasks, governance of regions, oversight of nations, or participation in councils where decrees are issued. Their authority is derivative, not absolute. The Genesis narrative aligns with this model by presenting the sons of God as participants in a system rather than independent actors. Their transgression lies in stepping outside that system. The immediate narrative response reinforces this reading. The record shifts from description to limitation. A divine declaration sets a boundary on human lifespan, marking a withdrawal of tolerance rather than an emotional reaction. This response addresses the world as a whole, not the sons of God specifically. Yet it occurs directly after their action, suggesting a causal relationship rooted in systemic imbalance rather than individual fault. The absence of direct judgment against the sons of God at this stage is notable. The text does not name punishment, expulsion, or condemnation within this passage. Instead, it allows the consequences to unfold within the larger narrative of decline. This approach maintains focus on order rather than actors. The violation is acknowledged through its effects on the world, not through a detailed account of retribution. Ancient court language provides further clarity. In royal contexts, officials who exceeded their mandate were not always addressed publicly. Their actions were often corrected through structural change rather than public accusation. The Genesis narrative mirrors this pattern. The boundary is reasserted through limitation, signaling that the existing arrangement can no longer continue unchanged. This framing explains why later memory associated the episode with transgression rather than myth. The text does not invite wonder or admiration. It presents the event as part of a sequence leading toward judgment. The sons of God are not heroic or tragic figures. They are representatives of a system that has failed to maintain its limits. The placement of this passage between human multiplication and divine assessment is deliberate. It suggests that the crossing of boundaries coincides with unchecked expansion. As humanity spreads, oversight becomes compromised. The guardians themselves are drawn into the disorder they were meant to regulate. This inversion of role intensifies the sense of instability permeating the narrative. The term sons of God, then, functions as an institutional marker. It identifies a class rather than individuals, a role rather than a personality. The narrative does not ask who they were by name, but what they represented within the structure of the world. Their action signals a breakdown not only among humans, but within the systems meant to preserve balance. This understanding prepares the ground for later elaboration without requiring it. The Genesis account establishes the essential elements: a boundary, a crossing, and a resulting imbalance. It does so with minimal exposition, trusting that the significance of these elements would be understood within its original context. Over time, as that context faded, the phrase "sons of God" became a point of inquiry rather than assumption. By the end of this passage, the boundary has been crossed and quietly reasserted. The narrative moves forward, leaving the episode unresolved in detail but fixed in implication. The sons of God have acted beyond their sphere, and the world bears the weight of that action. The record does not dwell on the mechanics of the crossing. It preserves the fact of it, allowing its significance to resonate without explanation. The record's refusal to elaborate on the identity of the sons of God does not diminish the gravity of their action. Instead, it anchors the episode within a framework of delegated authority and breached responsibility. The narrative treats the crossing of boundaries as a matter of order, not curiosity. This distinction becomes clearer when the language of oversight is examined more closely. In ancient systems, those placed in positions of supervision were expected to maintain separation from the populations they governed. Proximity threatened impartiality. Entanglement eroded authority. Within this framework, the union described in Genesis represents a failure of restraint. The sons of God are depicted not as autonomous agents seeking connection, but as figures who abandon their assigned distance. The act of taking wives is presented as unilateral, lacking negotiation or covenant. This absence reinforces the impression of overreach rather than mutual exchange. The text does not describe marriage as an institution here, but as an act of appropriation that collapses distinction. The narrative's economy continues to serve its purpose. By avoiding description of the offspring's nature at this stage, the record keeps attention fixed on the violation itself. The concern is not what results biologically, but what occurs structurally. A line meant to remain intact has been crossed. The world that follows is marked by instability, not because of novelty, but because of imbalance. Ancient conceptions of divine hierarchy help clarify this point. In many traditions, the divine realm is depicted as ordered, with roles assigned and authority distributed. Disorder in that realm has consequences for the human world. The Genesis account reflects this understanding by linking heavenly transgression with earthly decline. The sons of God do not act in isolation. Their behavior participates in a broader unraveling that affects all levels of existence. The narrative's treatment of time reinforces this connection. The declaration limiting human lifespan introduces a temporal boundary where one had not been previously emphasized. Time itself becomes regulated in response to overreach. This measure is not framed as punishment, but as containment. It signals that the existing configuration of the world can no longer sustain itself without restriction. A concrete anchor appears in the way ancient legal texts address breaches of mandate. When officials exceeded their authority, the response often involved restructuring systems rather than addressing individuals directly. The Genesis narrative mirrors this approach. The focus remains on recalibrating the world's parameters rather than detailing the fate of the sons of God. Their punishment, if it exists at this stage, is implicit within the altered order. This restraint leaves interpretive space, but it also sets limits. The text does not portray the sons of God as creators of a new order. They do not establish a lineage or institution within the narrative. Their action is disruptive but not constructive. This distinction prevents the episode from being read as an origin story for a rival system. Instead, it remains a cautionary moment within the larger account of decline. The memory of this episode is shaped by its brevity. Because the Genesis narrative does not resolve the identity or fate of the sons of God, later readers are drawn to the gap. Yet the original text resists being read as incomplete. It accomplishes its purpose by marking a boundary and showing its violation. The absence of detail is part of the design. This design becomes clearer when the episode is considered alongside other boundary crossings in the primeval history. Each transgression involves a movement beyond assigned limits, knowledge taken prematurely, life extended unlawfully, roles reversed. The Sons of God episode fits this pattern precisely. It is another instance in which order is compromised through the abandonment of restraint. By situating the episode within this sequence, the record avoids isolating it as exceptional. It becomes part of a continuum of failures that culminate in judgment. The sons of God are not singled out as uniquely corrupt. They are participants in a broader erosion of boundaries that affects all levels of creation. The absence of theological argumentation within the passage reinforces its documentary tone. The narrative does not explain why the boundary exists. It assumes its validity. This assumption reflects an ancient worldview in which order is foundational rather than debated. The crossing of boundaries is self-evidently problematic, requiring no justification. As the narrative moves forward, The memory of the sons of God recedes, but the implications of their action remain embedded in the text. The world is now one in which limits must be imposed, not assumed. Oversight has failed, and containment becomes necessary. This shift prepares the conceptual ground for later interpretations that seek to explain the nature of the violation more fully. In subsequent traditions, the sons of God will be named, ranked, and judged. Their actions will be expanded into narratives of instruction and punishment. Yet these developments grow from the restraint of the Genesis account rather than correcting it. The original passage establishes the essential problem, a breach of boundary that destabilizes the world. This chapter concludes with the recognition that the phrase "sons of God" functions as a structural indicator rather than a descriptive label. It identifies a role within an ordered system and records the moment that role is compromised. The narrative does not dwell on the figures themselves. It records the crossing and moves on. By doing so, the primeval record preserves a tension that later generations will attempt to resolve. The boundary has been crossed, but the text does not explain how it will be restored. That question remains open, carried forward into later interpretations that seek to address what the Genesis account deliberately leaves undefined. The expansion of the primeval account begins not within the canonical narrative itself, but in texts that position themselves as explanations of its silences. Among these, the writings attributed to Enoch occupy a central place. Where Genesis preserved restraint, these texts introduce structure. Where the earlier record named without elaboration, the Watcher traditions define, enumerate, and assign responsibility. The shift is deliberate and reflects a new literary aim, not preservation but clarification. The Watcher texts do not dispute the Genesis account. They assume it as their foundation. Their purpose is to address what the record left unspoken by tracing causes, actors, and consequences. The phrase "sons of God" is no longer left undefined. It is rendered as a specific class of beings, watchers, whose function is described in terms of observation, oversight, and delegated authority. Their descent is not implied but narrated. A concrete anchor appears immediately in the geography of the narrative. The Watchers descend upon a mountain, named and fixed within the landscape. Mountains in ancient literature function as meeting points between realms, sites of covenant, revelation, and judgment. By situating the descent there, the text signals a formal crossing rather than a casual one. This is not a wandering encounter. It is an organized movement with a defined setting. The descent itself is described collectively. The Watchers act as a group, bound by mutual agreement. They do not stumble into transgression individually. They swear an oath, binding themselves to a shared decision. This institutional language is significant. Oaths in ancient societies formalize intent and distribute responsibility. By including this element, the text frames the event as a coordinated breach rather than an isolated failure. Names are introduced where Genesis offered none. Leaders among the Watchers are identified, ranked, and assigned particular roles. This naming serves several functions. It anchors the narrative in accountability. It also mirrors human structures of authority, where leaders bear greater responsibility for collective action. The Watcher tradition thus translates a cosmic violation into terms familiar to social and legal order. With the Watchers defined, the Nephilim are reintroduced in expanded form. They are no longer a term preserved without explanation. They are presented as the direct result of the Watchers' descent, given scale and impact. Their defining characteristic is not merely size but effect. They consume resources, disrupt communities, and introduce violence into the human sphere. The emphasis remains on consequence rather than spectacle. The Watcher texts link this devastation to the transmission of forbidden knowledge. Specific practices are named: metallurgy, enchantment, divination, and warfare. These are not portrayed as neutral skills. They are framed as premature or unauthorized, given to humanity outside proper channels. The Nephilim become agents through which this knowledge accelerates disorder, amplifying its effects across society. This focus on knowledge introduces a new dimension absent from the Genesis account. The problem is no longer only boundary crossing, but instruction without authorization. The Watchers are no longer simply figures who abandon restraint. They become teachers who violate trust. The Nephilim, as their offspring, embody the consequences of this violation in tangible form. Institutional language continues to shape the narrative. Judgment is not immediate. Complaints rise from the earth itself, personified as bearing witness to violence and imbalance. Appeals are made to higher authority. Councils convene. Decisions are rendered. This structure reflects ancient legal processes where accusations are presented, deliberated, and resolved within a hierarchy. The punishment of the Watchers is described in terms that mirror their crime. Those who abandon their station are bound and confined. The language emphasizes restriction rather than annihilation. Chains, darkness, and designated places of holding replace the freedom they misused. This symmetry reinforces the moral logic of the narrative. Boundaries crossed are boundaries reimposed. The Nephilim, by contrast, are addressed through consequence rather than confinement. Their destruction is framed as necessary to restore balance. They are not rehabilitated or judged individually. They represent a condition that must end for the world to continue. This distinction separates responsibility from result, assigning blame to the Watchers while acknowledging the impact of their actions. The flood emerges within this framework as a final corrective measure. It is not portrayed as arbitrary or sudden. It follows investigation, appeal, and judgment. The Watcher traditions thus recast the flood as the culmination of a legal and cosmic process rather than a singular act of divine will. This reframing addresses the question left open by Genesis: why such total judgment was required. The expansion found in these texts reflects a historical need for coherence. Communities encountering the Genesis account sought to reconcile its brevity with the scale of its outcome. The Watcher narrative provides causality where the earlier record preserved silence. It does so by translating cosmic disorder into institutional failure, a language that resonates with societies governed by law and hierarchy. Yet even as it expands, the Watcher tradition maintains continuity with the primeval account. It does not deny the flood. It does not alter the sequence of events. It fills the space between transgression and judgment with structure, nomming what Genesis left unnamed. In doing so, it transforms the Nephilim from a textual marker into an active element within a broader explanatory system. By the close of this phase, the Nephilim are no longer simply present. They are positioned within a network of cause and effect. Their existence is tied to decisions made by specific agents within a defined hierarchy. The world's collapse becomes intelligible within a moral and cosmic order. The narrative has shifted. What was once a problem of record has become a problem of responsibility. The silence has been addressed, though not resolved. The Watcher traditions offer explanation, not closure. They prepare the ground for further reflection, even as they remain outside the boundaries of formal canon. As the Watcher traditions continue, the narrative focus tightens around the administration of justice. The disorder introduced into the world is no longer described in general terms, but traced through specific channels of accountability. The Watchers are addressed individually and collectively, and their actions are measured against the roles they were assigned. This judicial framing distinguishes the Watcher texts from earlier narrative restraint. Explanation becomes an ethical necessity rather than an interpretive option. The structure of judgment is presented through a sequence of appeals and decrees. Intermediary figures carry reports upward, describing the condition of the earth and the scale of devastation. Violence is quantified through its effects on land, population, and stability. This procedural language mirrors ancient legal systems in which testimony precedes verdict. The narrative does not rush to condemnation. It records a process. Within this framework, the Nephilim occupy a specific function. They are not judged in the same manner as the Watchers, because they are not presented as decision-makers. Their agency is real but derivative. They act as instruments through which the consequences of forbidden knowledge become visible. Their violence is expansive, but it is framed as the outworking of an earlier breach rather than an independent rebellion. The destruction of the Nephilim is therefore depicted as remedial. Their removal is necessary to halt the spread of disorder. The language emphasizes cessation rather than punishment. This distinction reinforces the separation between responsibility and consequence established earlier. The Watchers bear guilt. The Nephilim embody outcome. The world cannot be corrected without addressing both. A concrete anchor emerges in the imagery of confinement. The Watchers are bound in designated locations, often described with precise spatial markers. Valleys, depths, and darkness replace the mountain of descent. These locations function as institutional holding spaces rather than places of annihilation. The emphasis remains on restriction and delay, not final destruction. Judgment is ongoing, extending beyond the immediate narrative. This temporal extension serves a broader purpose. By postponing final resolution, the Watcher traditions integrate the primeval crisis into a longer moral horizon. The flood resolves the immediate disorder, but the consequences of the Watchers' actions persist. Their confinement continues until the time of judgment, a phrase that situates the narrative within an extended framework of accountability. The Watcher texts also introduce a cosmological symmetry absent from the Genesis account. As the Watchers disrupted the boundary between realms, their punishment reinforces it. They are removed from the human sphere and prevented from further influence. Knowledge once transmitted without authorization is withdrawn. Order is restored through separation. This emphasis on separation aligns with the earlier concern for boundaries. Where Genesis stated the problem, the Watcher traditions articulate its solution. They do so by expanding the institutional logic already present in ancient thought. Authority is defined by role. Violation is addressed through removal and restriction. Restoration requires the reestablishment of distance. The flood, within this expanded narrative, becomes the final stage of a corrective sequence. It is not aimed at the Watchers, who are already confined, but at the world shaped by their actions. The Nephilim's devastation has altered human society beyond repair. The flood resets the conditions of life, allowing boundaries to be reintroduced under new terms. This reframing offers moral clarity to communities grappling with inherited ambiguity. The Watcher traditions do not merely satisfy curiosity. They address the ethical tension raised by the Genesis account, how a just order responds to systemic failure. By organizing responsibility and consequence, these texts provide a coherent explanation for the scale of judgment. At the same time, the Watcher traditions remain conscious of their position outside formal canon. Their authority is persuasive rather than legislative. They circulate as interpretive expansions, not replacements. This status allows them to explore questions the canonical text leaves untouched while preserving respect for its structure. The influence of these traditions is evident in their careful balance of innovation and continuity. They do not introduce new outcomes. They reinterpret existing ones. The flood remains. The judgment stands. What changes is the narrative density between cause and effect. The silence of Genesis is filled with process, names, and institutions. This expansion also reshapes the understanding of the Nephilim. No longer a term suspended in ambiguity, they become integral to an explanation of cosmic disorder. Their identity is defined relationally, through their connection to the Watchers and the knowledge transmitted. Their fate is sealed by necessity rather than decree. By the close of the Watcher narrative, the primeval world is fully accounted for. Every action is traced, every violation addressed. Yet this completeness introduces a new tension. The clarity offered by these texts exceeds that of the canonical record. It satisfies questions Genesis leaves open, but at the cost of narrative restraint. This tension shapes how later communities receive the Watcher traditions. They are valued for their explanatory power, yet approached with caution. Their detailed cosmology clarifies, but also complicates. The Nephilim are now firmly linked to transgression, not merely presence. The problem of record has become a problem of interpretation. As this chapter concludes, the expansion achieved by the Watcher tradition stands complete. The sons of God are named. The boundaries are defined. The Nephilim are explained as agents of devastation rather than anomalies. The flood is rendered necessary through structured judgment. The silences of the primeval record have been filled, even as they continue to invite scrutiny in the traditions that follow. Within the expanded traditions, attention shifts away from origins and toward consequence. The Nephilim are no longer defined by how they came into being, but by what they do to the world they inhabit. Their actions are described with a consistency that transcends individual texts. Violence increases, resources are consumed beyond renewal, and social structures fail under pressure. The narrative focus narrows, not to spectacle, but to impact. These descriptions are anchored in ancient concerns that govern how communities understood survival. Land was finite, harvests fragile, and population balance essential. Texts that speak of the Nephilim emphasize not only aggression toward humans, but disruption of the ground itself. Fields are stripped, animals destroyed, and cycles of cultivation broken. The giants are remembered as forces that exhaust the environment rather than merely dominate it. Violence in these accounts is not episodic, it becomes systemic. The Nephilim are portrayed as overwhelming existing mechanisms of restraint. Cities, clans, and households cannot contain them. This inability to regulate marks a critical threshold. Ancient societies viewed uncontainable violence as a sign that order had failed at a foundational level. The Nephilim are situated precisely at that point of failure. Consumption becomes a central motif. The giants devour not only livestock and produce, but eventually turn upon humanity itself. This progression is deliberate. It illustrates a world where normal hierarchies of need and provision have collapsed. What begins as excess ends as inversion. The giants no longer participate in the economy of life. They dismantle it. This emphasis reflects a worldview in which balance was sacred. Sacred limits governed what could be taken, when, and by whom. The Nephilim's actions violate these limits repeatedly. Their hunger is described as unregulated, their reach unchecked. The narrative does not dwell on their physical form. Size is secondary to effect. What matters is that nothing remains outside their reach. Ancient legal and ritual texts often link disorder in the land to moral failure. When boundaries are crossed, the ground itself responds through famine, barrenness, or collapse. The Watcher traditions extend this logic by portraying the Nephilim as accelerants of such conditions. Their presence intensifies instability until the land can no longer sustain life as ordered. A concrete anchor appears in the repeated association between the giants and bloodshed. Blood is described as filling the earth, a phrase that carries legal weight. In ancient thought, blood cried out for response. It demanded adjudication. The emphasis on bloodshed situates the Nephilim within a judicial framework rather than a mythical one. Their actions constitute crimes against the order of creation. The response from the heavenly court reflects this framing. Judgment is directed not at the mere existence of the giants but at the conditions they produce. The record emphasizes complaint, witness, and verdict. The earth testifies. Humanity suffers. The court responds. This sequence underscores that the problem is systemic disorder, not anomalous beings. Domination emerges as another defining trait. The Nephilim are depicted as imposing their will without negotiation or covenant. Authority in these texts is legitimate only when bounded by role and restraint. The giants exercise power without limit, bypassing all structures of accountability. This unchecked domination further erodes social cohesion. The narratives avoid portraying the Nephilim as rulers in any formal sense. They do not establish laws or institutions. Their dominance is parasitic rather than administrative. This distinction is crucial. Ancient audiences distinguished between harsh rule and lawlessness. The Nephilim belong to the latter category. They destroy order without replacing it. The cumulative effect of these actions reframes how the Nephilim are remembered. They are no longer primarily figures with an identity problem. They become conditions embodied. Violence, overconsumption, and domination are not traits added to their story. They are the story. The giants function as living expressions of chaos. This reframing explains why later texts speak of them collectively rather than individually. Names recede. Actions remain. The Nephilim are recalled as a force rather than a lineage. Their memory condenses around what they did to the world, not who they were within it. The agricultural focus of these accounts reinforces this point. Land stability was central to covenantal thought. A world where crops fail and herds vanish is a world out of alignment. By linking the Nephilim to such outcomes, the texts anchor cosmic disorder in daily experience. Chaos is not abstract. It is measurable in loss. The narrative logic remains consistent. As disorder increases, the possibility of correction diminishes. The giants' actions push the world beyond the reach of incremental repair. Ritual, law, and social restraint are no longer sufficient. This escalation prepares the conceptual ground for total judgment without invoking it prematurely. Importantly, the texts do not attribute intention to the Nephilim in philosophical terms. They do not debate motive. The focus remains on effect. Ancient legal reasoning often prioritized outcome over internal state. Damage required response regardless of intent. The Nephilim's devastation meets that threshold repeatedly. This approach allows the narrative to maintain restraint even while expanding detail. The giants are not demonized through rhetoric. They are assessed through consequence. Their existence becomes untenable because the world cannot survive their impact. By the close of this phase, the Nephilim are fully defined as agents of disorder. Their legacy is not mystery, but imbalance. They are remembered less as beings who crossed a boundary and more as conditions that erased it. The world they inhabit cannot remain ordered while they persist. This understanding shifts the narrative emphasis decisively. Attention moves away from origins and toward aftermath. The question is no longer how such figures came to be, but how a world marked by their actions can be restored. As the traditions continue, the memory of the Nephilim becomes increasingly abstracted from individual form. Their actions accumulate into patterns, and those patterns define how the world is understood to have failed. The giants are no longer recalled as isolated figures moving through history, but as a sustained pressure exerted upon every structure that once maintained balance. Their presence transforms the landscape into a field of continual instability. This transformation is most clearly expressed in the way ancient texts describe the land's response. Soil that once produced in measure becomes exhausted. Waters once sufficient turned scarce or corrupted. These descriptions align with a worldview in which the land participates in moral order. When limits are respected, the land yields. When they are violated, it withdraws. The Nephilim, through unchecked consumption and violence, are positioned as catalysts for this withdrawal. The collapse of agricultural rhythm carries social consequences. Without predictable harvests, communities cannot plan, trade, or sustain lineage. Kinship structures weaken. Migration increases. Conflict over remaining resources intensifies. The texts do not linger on these details individually, but they are implied within the broader description of chaos. The giant's impact radiates outward, affecting every level of life. This systemic breakdown explains why the heavenly court responds as it does. The focus remains on remediation rather than retaliation. The problem is not that extraordinary beings exist, but that the world has been rendered uninhabitable under their influence. The court's concern is ecological and social stability as much as moral order. Judgment is framed as a necessary intervention to preserve the possibility of life. A concrete anchor appears in the language of witness. The earth, humanity, and even the natural order are described as bearing testimony. This imagery draws from legal traditions in which multiple witnesses establish the validity of a claim. The accumulation of disorder becomes evidence. The Nephilim's actions are measured not by accusation, but by observable outcome. The giant's domination further undermines the legitimacy of authority. In ancient thought, power is justified only when it serves preservation. Rule that consumes rather than protects forfeits its claim. The Nephilim's dominance lacks covenant, mandate, or restraint. It is power detached from responsibility. This detachment marks them as antithetical to ordered existence. Later retellings preserve this assessment by shifting emphasis away from physical description. References to size become secondary or symbolic. What endures is the association with destruction. Giants become shorthand for overwhelming force that destabilizes rather than governs. The Nephilim thus transition from characters in a narrative to conceptual markers within cultural memory. This shift is significant for understanding how the flood is remembered. In these traditions, the flood is not directed at giants alone. It addresses the condition they have produced. The water becomes a means of resetting boundaries that have been erased. The land, overwhelmed by violence and consumption, is cleared to restore measure and rhythm. The absence of remorse or reform among the Nephilim reinforces the necessity of this response. The texts do not depict attempts at negotiation or change. The giants do not withdraw, limit themselves, or restore what they have taken. Their persistence confirms that incremental correction is no longer possible. The world requires a decisive intervention. By framing the Nephilim as agents of disorder rather than tragic figures, the traditions avoid moral ambiguity. Sympathy is not extended. The focus remains on preservation. The question is not whether the giants could have been redeemed, but whether the world could survive their continued presence. The answer, consistently, is no. This framing also reshapes how later generations engage with the memory of the Nephilim. They are invoked not to explore origins but to warn of outcomes. Their story becomes instructive through its consequences. Excess, when unchecked, consumes its own foundations. Power, when detached from limit, collapses the systems that sustain it. The emphasis on sacred limits ties the narrative back to earlier boundary concerns. Where the sons of God crossed between realms, the Nephilim erased distinctions within the world itself. Human and animal, consumption and destruction, authority and domination blur together. Chaos is no longer a breach at the edges, it permeates the center. As a result, the Nephilim are remembered less as transgressors and more as manifestations. They embody what happens when order dissolves. This embodiment allows later texts to reference them without recounting their story. Their name evokes a condition already understood. By the end of this chapter, the Nephilim have completed their transformation within the tradition. They are no longer primarily figures of mixed origin. They are remembered as forces that unmake the world. Their defining feature is not who they were, but what they did to land, society, and stability. This understanding prepares the narrative for its next movement. Once the giants are removed, memory itself becomes the site of interpretation. The question shifts from how disorder arose to how it is recalled after judgment. The Nephilim, having served as agents of collapse, now persist only as echoes within the record, shaping how later generations interpret both past catastrophe and present order. After the flood narrative closes, the record presents a changed world. Lineage resumes, lands are apportioned, and history proceeds with renewed structure. Yet within this reordered landscape, familiar names surface again: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, figures described as unusually formidable, remembered for stature or strength. Their appearance introduces a quiet tension. The flood was said to cleanse the world, yet memory preserves traces that resemble what came before. These post-flood references do not revive the primeval framework. The texts do not speak of watchers, descent, or heavenly transgression. Instead, the giants are situated firmly within historical settings. They appear in geographical surveys, territorial boundaries, and battle accounts. The language shifts decisively from cosmology to historiography. What remains is not an explanation of origin, but a record of presence. Ancient compilers handled this tension with restraint. They did not attempt to reconcile the giants of later history with the Nephilim of the primeval world through explicit connection. The names are preserved, but the framework is not repeated. This editorial choice signals a transition in how such figures were understood. They are no longer treated as agents of cosmic disorder, but as remnants within human history. A concrete anchor appears in the geographical lists that accompany these references. Regions are named alongside the peoples who inhabit them. The Anakim are associated with specific cities. The Rephaim are linked to valleys and territories. These associations ground the figures in place rather than myth. They belong to maps and boundaries, not to primordial upheaval. The narrative tone in these passages is measured. The giants are noted, not explained. Their presence is acknowledged as part of the historical landscape encountered by later generations. This approach aligns with the broader method of the historical books, which prioritize continuity of record over resolution of ambiguity. What is remembered is what was encountered, not what was theorized. Battle accounts provide another anchor. When giants appear in these narratives, they do so as opponents within human conflict. They are not invincible forces of chaos. They can be challenged, defeated, and recorded. The emphasis rests on military encounter rather than existential threat. This framing marks a significant shift from earlier traditions, where the giants' impact exceeded the capacity of human response. Royal records further reinforce this shift. Kings are measured against formidable adversaries, and victories over such figures enhance royal legitimacy. The giants become part of the political memory of conquest and rule. Their significance is reframed through power dynamics rather than cosmic violation. They test the strength of leaders, not the stability of creation. This reframing does not deny the memory of earlier disorder. Instead, it contains it. By embedding the giants within historical narrative, the texts prevent a return to primordial crisis. The world is no longer at risk of collapse because of their presence. Order, once restored, proves resilient. Giants can exist within it without undoing it. The compilers' silence regarding origins is deliberate. They resist reopening questions that the flood narrative had closed. The giants are allowed to persist as historical anomalies rather than theological problems. This restraint preserves narrative coherence. The record moves forward without being drawn back into unresolved cosmology. This approach reflects an ancient understanding of memory. Not all inherited names require renewed explanation. Some function as markers of reputation rather than identity. The giants' names carry weight, but their meaning has shifted. They evoke fear or respect within history, not dread of cosmic imbalance. The tension, however, is not erased. Readers attentive to the earlier tradition recognize the echo. The presence of giants after the flood invites comparison, even as the text refuses to make it explicit. This unresolved quality becomes part of the record's texture. Silence once again plays a defining role. The absence of the Watcher framework in these later passages is especially notable. There is no appeal to heavenly counsels or transgression. Responsibility is entirely human. Conflicts arise from territory, power, and ambition. The giants are participants in these dynamics, not catalysts of collapse. This containment allows the narrative to explore a new theme, the management of power. Where the Nephilim once embodied unchecked domination, the post-flood giants test the capacity of human institutions to regulate strength. Kings, armies, and laws now stand between disorder and stability. The problem has shifted from existence to governance. The memory of giants thus becomes historical rather than primordial. They are remembered because they were encountered, not because they threatened the order of the world. Their legacy is preserved through lists and accounts that prioritize factual continuity over mythic explanation. By treating these figures as echoes rather than continuations, the record maintains distance from earlier catastrophe. The flood remains decisive. What follows belongs to a different mode of history, one governed by covenant, law, and kingship. This chapter's focus rests on that transition. The giants persist in memory, but their meaning has changed. They are no longer conditions of chaos. They are challenges within history. The unresolved tension they introduce is managed through narrative restraint rather than resolution. In this way, the record prepares for a new interpretive lens. Power, legitimacy, and rule come to the forefront. The giant's presence will now be measured against human authority rather than cosmic order. As the historical record advances, the giant's presence becomes increasingly integrated into the normal rhythms of human conflict and settlement. They are cataloged alongside other peoples, their names preserved without special commentary. This treatment reflects a deliberate shift in emphasis. What once required cosmic explanation is now handled through administrative memory. The giants are no longer anomalies demanding interpretation. They are populations encountered, assessed, and in many cases displaced. The texts that preserve these references often do so within boundary descriptions. Valleys, plains, and fortified cities are named with precision. The Rephaim are associated with a region known for its breadth. The Anakim are tied to hill country and fortified towns. These geographical anchors serve to localize what had once been universal. The giants belong to specific places, not to the world as a whole. This localization alters how their significance is understood. Threat is no longer existential. It is situational. A giant population may dominate a region, but it does not destabilize creation. The problem has been scaled down from cosmic disorder to territorial challenge. This scaling reflects confidence in the post-flood order. The world, though imperfect, is no longer fragile in the same way. Genealogical notices further reinforce this containment. The giants are sometimes listed among the descendants of particular groups, without elaboration. This inclusion integrates them into human history rather than isolating them as remnants of a different age. The record treats them as part of the same historical fabric as other peoples, subject to the same movements and conflicts. Notably, the texts avoid attributing exceptional origin stories to these groups. There is no attempt to connect them explicitly to the Nephilim of the primeval record. This silence suggests an editorial decision to preserve continuity without reopening cosmological debate. The names endure, but the framework has shifted. The battle narratives deepen this reframing. Encounters with giants are described in practical terms: strategy, terrain, outcome. Victory or defeat hinges on leadership, courage, and organization. The giant's size or reputation is acknowledged, but it does not determine the outcome. Human agency has reasserted itself as the primary factor in history. Royal memory plays a crucial role here. Kings are remembered for their ability to confront formidable opponents. Triumph over giants becomes a measure of legitimate rule. These narratives do not glorify violence for its own sake. They emphasize order restored through authority. The giant's defeat confirms that power can be contained within lawful structures. This emphasis on kingship marks a significant interpretive turn. Where the Watcher traditions located failure in cosmic hierarchy, the historical books locate resolution in human governance. The presence of giants tests leadership rather than threatening creation. The problem of disorder has been transferred from the heavens to the throne. At the same time, the record preserves nuance. Not all giants are immediately eliminated. Some persist across generations. Their endurance underscores the complexity of history. Order is maintained not through total eradication of difference, but through ongoing negotiation and conflict. Stability is achieved gradually, not absolutely. The memory of giants thus becomes layered. They are feared, respected, and sometimes mythologized, but always within the bounds of history. Their names carry weight because of past encounters, not because of unresolved cosmic questions. This layering allows the tradition to honor memory without reviving primordial anxiety. The absence of explanatory commentary remains striking. Later readers may sense the echo of earlier traditions, but the text does not guide them toward that connection. The giants stand on their own terms within the historical narrative. This restraint preserves the integrity of both periods. The primeval and the historical are not collapsed into one another. This approach also reflects an ancient understanding of catastrophe and recovery. A world that has undergone judgment does not return to its former state. It moves forward under new conditions. The giant's survival as historical figures does not negate the flood's significance. It demonstrates that disorder can recur in limited forms without undoing the larger restoration. By the close of this chapter, the Nephilim have fully transitioned into memory. Their legacy persists through names and reputations, not through active threat. The giants of later history are echoes, not continuations. They remind the record of what once was without reintroducing it. This reframing prepares the narrative for its next phase. Attention will turn increasingly to how power is organized and legitimized within human society. The giants, once symbols of chaos, now serve as measures against which authority is tested and defined. As the narrative moves further into recorded history, the language used to describe exceptional figures undergoes a noticeable shift. Terms once associated with primordial disorder are now applied within political and military contexts. Strength, stature, and renown are no longer signs of cosmic imbalance, but markers of authority and legitimacy. The record begins to speak a new dialect, one shaped by throne rooms, campaigns, and dynastic memory. Ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions provide an essential anchor for this transition. Kings are regularly portrayed as towering figures, both physically and symbolically. Their bodies are described as imposing, their presence as overwhelming. Such language does not function as anatomical report. It signals favor, dominance, and the ability to impose order. Greatness is measured through visibility and effect rather than origin. Within this framework, figures remembered for extraordinary might are absorbed into political narrative. Warriors of unusual size or strength are not treated as anomalies requiring explanation. They are celebrated or feared as instruments of rule. The emphasis rests on what they accomplish on behalf of a king or a people. Their reputation reinforces the authority they serve. This rhetorical environment reshapes how earlier memories are read. Language once associated with the Nephilim, greatness, renown, fear, reappears but stripped of cosmological implication. It now belongs to the vocabulary of kingship. The extraordinary is no longer a threat to order. It becomes a tool for maintaining it. Royal courts played a central role in this adaptation. Court historians preserved memory selectively, emphasizing traits that supported legitimacy. Victories were recorded. Enemies were magnified to elevate triumph. Descriptions of size and might functioned rhetorically, transforming conflict into proof of divine favor or rightful rule. Within such records, greatness is a political asset. A concrete anchor appears in the way kings are described as chosen or favored. Divine association does not imply transgression, but sanction. Strength flows downward from the divine realm through legitimate authority. This vertical alignment contrasts sharply with earlier narratives of boundary crossing. Power is now framed as granted, not seized. Warrior figures associated with kingship inherit this framing. Their stature becomes symbolic of the order they defend. A mighty champion stands as evidence that the kingdom is protected. Fearsome reputation deters rivals. These figures are integrated into the machinery of state rather than standing apart from it. This integration alters how earlier terms are understood. Words that once signaled danger now signify prestige. Great men are celebrated. Renown is desirable. The record adapts its language to reflect this shift. What matters is not origin but alignment. A figure's greatness is acceptable, even necessary, when tethered to lawful authority. The memory of giants participates in this transformation. Where earlier traditions emphasized devastation, later narratives emphasize confrontation and control. Giants are encountered, challenged, and defeated. Their size magnifies the achievement of the victor. They serve the story of kingship by testing its strength. This reframing does not erase earlier traditions. It repurposes them. The fear once associated with the Nephilim is redirected. Instead of destabilizing the world, it heightens the drama of political struggle. Chaos is no longer embodied in beings, but in enemies subdued by rightful power. Genealogical memory adapts accordingly. Lineage becomes a tool for legitimacy. Heroes and kings are linked to ancestors of renown. Greatness is inherited symbolically rather than biologically. The language of descent functions metaphorically, connecting present authority to remembered strength. In this context, the Nephilim can be reconsidered not as literal progenitors, but as archetypes of greatness. Their memory supplies a vocabulary for describing exceptional authority. The record does not claim descent. It borrows language. This borrowing allows ancient communities to express continuity without reviving primordial anxiety. The shift toward political explanation reflects historical necessity. As institutions solidify, disorder must be accounted for within human systems. Kingship absorbs the language of power once reserved for mythic figures. Authority is no longer measured against cosmic boundaries, but against rival rulers and hostile territories. Military campaigns provide another anchor. Accounts of battle emphasize scale and intensity. Enemies are depicted as formidable. victories are correspondingly magnified. The rhetoric of greatness serves to legitimate expansion and consolidation. Within this framework, exceptional opponents enhance rather than threaten the narrative of order. This development creates a subtle tension. Language once used to warn now persuades. The same terms that mark disorder are redeployed to celebrate control. The record does not resolve this tension explicitly. It allows language to evolve alongside institutions, trusting context to guide interpretation. By grounding greatness in human structures, the narrative distances itself from cosmological explanation. The world is no longer fragile. Power can be exercised without unraveling creation. Exceptional figures are no longer signs of impending judgment. They are components of history. This adaptation also preserves continuity. The past is not discarded. Its language is retained and redirected. Memory becomes a resource rather than a warning. The Nephilim's legacy persists, but its meaning has shifted. As this chapter progresses, the listener encounters a world where greatness is contested, displayed, and institutionalized. The language of size and might no longer destabilizes the record. It reinforces authority. The question is no longer how such figures came to be, but whom they serve. As royal language settles into the record, the figure of the warrior becomes central to how greatness is understood. Strength is no longer interpreted through origin or anomaly, but through loyalty and function. A powerful figure derives meaning from alignment with throne and covenant. This alignment determines whether might is remembered as legitimate or threatening. Ancient inscriptions and chronicles reinforce this principle by carefully framing exceptional individuals. Their feats are narrated within the context of service. Victories are attributed to the king's command or the deity's favor working through appointed agents. Even when a warrior's reputation eclipses others, the narrative reins it in, situating strength within an ordered hierarchy. This discipline of memory reshapes how earlier traditions are engaged. The language associated with the Nephilim does not disappear. It is translated. Greatness becomes symbolic capital. Renown is mobilized to support dynastic continuity. Exceptional stature or fearsome reputation signals a kingdom's stability rather than its vulnerability. A concrete anchor appears in dynastic records, where lineage is curated to convey legitimacy. Ancestral figures are remembered for their might, wisdom, or victories. These qualities are presented as inheritable in reputation, if not in form. The past supplies authority to the present through carefully managed memory. This process explains how the Nephilim could be retrospectively understood as symbolic ancestors rather than literal progenitors. Their memory contributes to a shared vocabulary of greatness. Kings and heroes are described as mighty or men of renown, phrases that echo earlier language without invoking its original context. The association is linguistic rather than biological. Such adaptation reflects a broader historical move toward political explanation. As societies organize around kingship, explanations for disorder and authority are located within human institutions. Cosmic transgression recedes from view. Responsibility and legitimacy are negotiated through law, lineage, and conquest. The heroic narratives that emerge in this period exemplify this shift. Exceptional opponents are portrayed as tests rather than threats. Their defeat confirms the rightness of the existing order. The larger the adversary, the greater the validation of authority. Giants, once symbols of chaos, become narrative instruments that magnify success. This reframing introduces interpretive tension. Language rooted in ancient fear is now used to inspire loyalty. The record does not resolve this tension explicitly. It relies on context to distinguish between destructive excess and sanctioned power. The same descriptors can condemn or celebrate, depending on alignment. The restraint of the text is evident in its refusal to speculate on origins. It does not ask whether kings or warriors descend from ancient figures of power. It focuses on function. Authority is demonstrated through action within established structures. Greatness is proven, not inherited through myth. This emphasis also reflects caution. By avoiding claims of divine or monstrous ancestry, the record preserves a clear boundary between ruler and deity. Kings may be favored, but they are not hybrids. Their legitimacy depends on obedience and justice, not on extraordinary origin. This distinction protects the narrative from reintroducing the very boundary violations it once condemned. Over time, this careful use of language allows ancient communities to draw on a deep reservoir of memory without destabilizing their worldview. The past is present, but controlled. Terms once heavy with cosmological meaning are repurposed to serve political clarity. The Nephilim in this light become part of the record's linguistic inheritance. They are no longer subjects of explanation, but sources of expression. Their legacy survives in the way greatness is spoken, not in claims about who ruled whom. Memory is transformed into metaphor. This transformation prepares the ground for later debates. As texts are read and reread across generations, questions arise about whether language should be taken literally or symbolically. The seeds of interpretive conflict are sown here, in the quiet adaptation of ancient terms to new institutions. By the end of this chapter, the listener stands within a world governed by kingship and law. Greatness is measured against order, not against heaven. The Nephilim have receded into the background, their influence felt in language rather than narrative. The stage is set for future readers to grapple with how memory, authority, and interpretation intersect within the record. As the record moved beyond its original linguistic setting, the meaning of inherited terms began to shift. Translation became not only a vehicle of preservation, but a quiet force of reinterpretation. The Nephilim, once embedded within a Hebrew narrative shaped by restraint and implication, entered new textual worlds where different assumptions governed how words were understood. The earliest and most influential of these transitions occurred with the rendering of Hebrew scripture into Greek. The translators responsible for this work did not approach the text as commentators. Their task was transmission, not explanation. Yet the act of choosing equivalents inevitably shaped perception. Hebrew terms that carried layered meanings tied to role and effect were matched with Greek words more closely associated with form and description. In this process, the Nephilim were rendered using language that emphasized magnitude. The Greek terms selected foregrounded size and strength, qualities immediately graspable by readers unfamiliar with Hebrew narrative economy. This choice did not invent a new idea, but it prioritized one aspect of the inherited memory over others. Function receded. Physicality advanced. This shift aligned with broader tendencies within Greek literary culture, where classification and description were valued. Extraordinary figures were often defined by visible traits. Scale became a primary marker of difference. When the Nephilim entered this framework, they were encountered first as beings of unusual stature rather than as narrative markers of disorder. A concrete anchor appears in the translation philosophy evident across the Septuagint. In many cases, translators preserved ambiguity where the source text was ambiguous. They resisted explanatory additions. Yet when ambiguity intersected with unfamiliar concepts, they selected terms that would be intelligible within Greek conceptual categories. The Nephilim were among these cases. The result was subtle but enduring. Later readers encountering the Greek text met the Nephilim already framed through physical description. The silence of the Hebrew narrative remained, but its center of gravity shifted. Questions of size arose before questions of role. The order of inquiry had been altered. This reframing carried forward into subsequent translations. As the text moved into Latin, Greek choices exerted influence. Latin translators inherited a tradition already shaped by physical emphasis. Terms associated with giants became standard. By this stage, the Nephilim were firmly associated with bodily scale in the imagination of readers, even though the underlying text remained restrained. Throughout these transitions, scribal responsibility remained evident. Translators did not embellish narratives or introduce new episodes. They preserved the structure of the text faithfully. The shifts that occurred were not acts of invention, but of prioritization. Certain aspects of meaning were carried forward more clearly than others. This process explains a growing divergence between textual fidelity and reader perception. The record itself had not changed, but the lenses through which it was read had multiplied. Each linguistic tradition brought its own assumptions about what constituted significance. In Greek and Latin contexts, visible traits often served as primary identifiers. The preservation of the term Nephilim, even when translated, reflects continued restraint. Translators did not replace the concept with explanatory phrases. They chose single words that gestured toward meaning without exhausting it. Ambiguity remained, but it was now shaped by different cultural expectations. As a result, later audiences encountered the Nephilim already framed as giants. This framing did not answer the questions raised by the primeval narrative. It redirected them. Inquiry moved toward nature and form rather than toward boundary and function. The silence of the text persisted, but its perceived subject had shifted. This chapter's focus rests on that quiet transformation. Translation did not resolve the problem of the Nephilim. It preserved it in altered form. By the time the text circulated widely beyond its original language, readers were primed to imagine beings of extraordinary size before considering the narrative conditions that first gave the term weight. As translations accumulated, the distance between the original narrative posture and later reception continued to widen. Each linguistic layer carried forward inherited assumptions, solidifying certain interpretations through repetition. By the time the Nephilim were read primarily through Greek and Latin texts, their association with physical enormity had become customary rather than interpretive. The question of scale was no longer raised, it was presumed. This presumption shaped how readers approached the surrounding passages. The brief appearance of the Nephilim in the primeval narrative was now read against a backdrop of expected physical description. Silence regarding size invited imaginative completion rather than restraint. What the Hebrew text had left undefined, later readers supplied through the vocabulary made available to them. Yet the translators themselves often resisted such completion. Their work exhibits careful attention to the limits of the source material. They did not add measurements, descriptions, or explanations. The restraint lay in allowing the chosen term to carry implication without expansion. The shift occurred not through commentary, but through linguistic association. A concrete anchor emerges in marginal traditions and glosses that accompanied later manuscripts. While the primary text remained unchanged, explanatory notes began to circulate alongside it. These notes reflected prevailing assumptions about giants and extraordinary beings. Though not part of the canonical text, they influenced how readers interpreted it. The boundary between translation and interpretation became porous. Despite this, the core textual tradition preserved ambiguity. The Nephilim were not equated explicitly with other giant figures from mythic literature. They remained distinct, even as they were read through similar categories. This distinction allowed the record to maintain continuity while absorbing new layers of meaning. The privileging of physicality over function had lasting effects. Readers became more inclined to ask what the Nephilim were rather than what their presence signified. Identity replaced impact as the primary focus of inquiry. The narrative's original emphasis on disorder and boundary crossing receded into the background. This shift did not occur uniformly. Some translators and readers remained attentive to the text's restraint, nodding where explanation was withheld. Others leaned into the descriptive possibilities offered by their linguistic environment. The divergence of interpretation widened, not because the text changed, but because the framework surrounding it multiplied. The role of scribes in this process was complex. Their commitment to faithful transmission prevented overt distortion. At the same time, their choices inevitably guided perception. The decision to render a term one way rather than another shaped generations of reading. Responsibility was exercised, but consequence followed. The Nephilim thus became a case study in how preservation and transformation coexist. The text endured, stable in structure and content. Meaning, however, moved within it. Emphasis shifted, questions changed, and interpretive paths diverged. By late antiquity, the cumulative effect was evident. The Nephilim were widely encountered as giants, their narrative functioned secondary to their imagined form. This did not erase earlier traditions, but it altered the order in which they were considered. Physicality came first. Context followed, if at all. This development explains why later debates often began from assumptions foreign to the original narrative. Discussions centered on nature, biology, and origin, rather than on boundary and order. The translation history had quietly reordered the terms of inquiry. As this chapter concludes, the listener is left with a record that has been faithfully preserved, yet subtly reframed. Translation did not solve the mystery of the Nephilim. It ensured its survival in new forms. The stage is set for interpretive divergence, as readers navigate between inherited language and the silences it carries forward. When rabbinic literature engages the Nephilim tradition, the tone changes decisively. The expansive explanations found in earlier apocalyptic texts give way to caution, containment, and selective silence. Rather than attempting to resolve inherited ambiguities, rabbinic sources often narrow them. The Nephilim are not denied, but they are repositioned, moved away from speculative cosmology and into the disciplined space of legal and moral reflection. This shift is inseparable from the institutional settings in which rabbinic interpretation developed. Study houses replaced visionary texts as primary sites of authority. Interpretation unfolded through debate, precedent, and close reading, not through narrative expansion. Within this environment, the Nephilim tradition was approached not as a mystery to be explored, but as a textual problem to be managed. A concrete anchor appears in the method of Midrash itself. Rabbinic exegesis often focuses on individual words, grammatical forms, and contextual placement. Where earlier traditions filled narrative gaps with story, rabbis interrogated the gaps themselves. The brevity of the Genesis passage became a feature rather than a flaw. Its silence was treated as intentional, guiding interpretation toward restraint. In this framework, the phrase "sons of God" is frequently redirected toward human categories. Judges, nobles, or powerful men are proposed as reference. This move does not aim to explain the Nephilim exhaustively. It serves to anchor responsibility within the human sphere. By doing so, rabbinic interpretation protects the text from speculative excess and reinforces ethical accountability. The Nephilim themselves are rarely described in detail. When mentioned, they function as cautionary examples rather than subjects of inquiry. Their presence underscores themes of arrogance, violence, or moral failure without inviting elaboration on their nature. The giants are reduced to moral markers, stripped of cosmological intrigue. This reduction reflects a broader rabbinic priority, the preservation of law and practice. Speculation about heavenly beings risked diverting attention from commandments, obligations, and communal order. By containing the Nephilim within ethical discourse, rabbinic teachers ensured that interpretation served lived discipline rather than imaginative exploration. Oral preservation plays a critical role here. Teachings were transmitted through repetition and debate, not fixed narrative. This mode favored clarity and applicability over expansive storytelling. Traditions that invited excessive speculation were less easily sustained. The Nephilim, lacking practical relevance, were therefore treated sparingly. Legal discourse further shaped this restraint. Rabbinic texts are deeply concerned with boundaries between permitted and forbidden, sacred and common. Speculative accounts of boundary-crossing beings posed a conceptual risk. By reframing the Nephilim in human terms, rabbis maintained clear distinctions essential to legal reasoning. This does not mean the tradition was dismissed. References persist, but they are brief and controlled. The Nephilim are acknowledged as part of the textual inheritance, yet they are not allowed to dominate it. Their ambiguity is tolerated, not exploited. A notable feature of this approach is its resistance to harmonization. Rabbinic literature does not attempt to reconcile the Nephilim with later giant traditions or apocalyptic accounts. Each reference stands on its own, interpreted within immediate textual context. This fragmentation prevents the construction of a unified speculative system. The emphasis on moral lesson over narrative coherence reflects an intentional choice. Interpretation is guided by what the text demands of its readers, not by curiosity about its silences. The Nephilim become reminders of excess rather than objects of fascination. This containment also serves a protective function. By limiting discussion, rabbinic authorities guard the community against interpretive paths that could undermine monotheistic clarity or legal focus. Heavenly hierarchies and hybrid beings remain peripheral, not central. The study house thus becomes a boundary-setting institution. Within its walls, inherited traditions are filtered through disciplined inquiry. The Nephilim pass through this filter diminished in narrative presence but sharpened in ethical implication. By the end of this phase, the Nephilim tradition has been significantly narrowed. It survives, but only in forms that support moral instruction and legal stability. The mystery remains unresolved, but it is deliberately kept at the margins. This restraint marks a turning point. While rabbinic literature contains the question, it does not eliminate it. Outside these boundaries, other traditions will continue to explore what has been set aside here. The containment of the Nephilim tradition within rabbinic literature reflects not uncertainty, but confidence in interpretive limits. By the time these discussions take shape, the primary concerns of the community have shifted decisively toward continuity, practice, and survival. Speculation about primordial beings offers little guidance for daily life governed by law. As a result, rabbinic voices consistently redirect attention from the extraordinary to the applicable. This redirection is visible in how rabbinic texts handle narrative gaps. Where earlier interpreters saw absence as invitation, rabbis often saw it as instruction. Silence indicated boundaries not to be crossed. The lack of detail surrounding the Nephilim was treated as purposeful, signaling that further elaboration was neither necessary nor desirable. The record had spoken sufficiently by speaking briefly. A concrete anchor appears in the use of parable and ethical analogy. When giants or figures of renown are referenced, they are employed to illustrate moral failure or hubris. Their scale becomes metaphorical rather than descriptive. Greatness without restraint serves as a warning, not a subject of inquiry. In this way, the Nephilim are absorbed into a broader moral vocabulary without retaining narrative autonomy. This approach preserves theological clarity. Rabbinic tradition is deeply attentive to the dangers of attributing excessive agency to non-human figures. Speculative hierarchies risk fragmenting authority and confusing responsibility. By emphasizing human accountability, rabbinic interpretation reinforces the primacy of law and choice. Disorder is traced to human action, not to cosmic interference. The institutional structure of rabbinic learning reinforces this outcome. Debate occurs within regulated frameworks, guided by precedent and communal consensus. Interpretations that stray too far from practical relevance are less likely to endure. Over time, this process shapes the tradition itself, favoring readings that stabilize rather than expand. Notably, this restraint does not require denial of earlier texts. Apocalyptic writings are known, but they are not integrated into legal discourse. Their speculative richness is acknowledged indirectly through absence. What is not cited becomes as significant as what is. The Nephilim, though present in the textual inheritance, are effectively sidelined. This sidelining creates a clear boundary between canonical interpretation and parallel exploration. Within rabbinic authority, the Nephilim are contained. Outside it, they remain available for elaboration. This division allows multiple interpretive streams to coexist without direct conflict. The rabbinic choice to limit discussion also reflects historical experience. Communities shaped by exile and regulation prioritized coherence and discipline. Myths that blurred boundaries between realms could destabilize already fragile structures. By focusing on law, rabbis anchored identity in practice rather than speculation. Over time, this approach influenced how the Nephilim were remembered or forgotten within mainstream tradition. They recede from prominence, appearing only when directly prompted by the text. Their mystery is preserved through neglect rather than exploration. The question remains, but it is held at a distance. This distance, however, is not absolute. The very act of containment acknowledges the power of the tradition being restrained. Boundaries are set precisely because something presses against them. The Nephilim continue to exist at the edge of discourse, defined as much by what is not said as by what is. As this chapter closes, the listener stands within a tradition that values restraint as an interpretive virtue. The Nephilim have been narrowed to moral signposts, their cosmological dimensions set aside. The record remains intact, but its speculative potential is deliberately curtailed. This containment prepares the way for divergence. While rabbinic literature establishes firm boundaries, other traditions will move beyond them, exploring what has been restricted here. The question of the Nephilim does not end. It changes location, shifting from the study house to other interpretive spaces where different priorities prevail. When early Christian writers encountered the Nephilim tradition, they did so through inherited layers already shaped by Jewish interpretation, translation, and restraint. The question before them was not whether the Nephilim existed in the record, but how such figures could be accommodated within an emerging theological system, increasingly concerned with coherence, orthodoxy, and instruction. What followed was not a unified response, but a period of divergence marked by careful negotiation. Early Christian texts reveal no single position. Instead, they preserve a spectrum of interpretation reflecting different priorities and audiences. Some writers, drawing on earlier Jewish apocalyptic traditions, retained elements of the Watcher framework. Others, influenced by rabbinic caution or philosophical reasoning, favored human-centered explanations. The Nephilim became a point of tension where inherited cosmology met developing doctrine. A concrete anchor appears in the patristic engagement with Genesis itself. Church writers approach the text as authoritative, yet open to interpretation. The brief Genesis passage was read alongside translated traditions, commentaries, and inherited lore. The Nephilim were thus encountered not in isolation, but within a complex interpretive environment where multiple explanations already circulated. Those inclined toward the Watcher interpretation emphasized continuity with earlier texts such as Enoch. For these writers, the descent of heavenly beings provided a compelling explanation for the scale of corruption preceding the flood. The Nephilim remained linked to transgression beyond the human sphere. This view preserved a cosmic dimension within Christian thought, aligning the primeval narrative with a broader vision of spiritual conflict. Other writers, however, expressed unease with this approach. The idea of angelic beings engaging in physical union raised doctrinal questions about the nature of angels and the integrity of creation. In response, alternative readings gained traction. The sons of God were interpreted as human figures, righteous lineages, judges, or rulers, whose moral failure, rather than heavenly rebellion, produced disorder. This divergence reflects differing theological emphases. Writers concerned with moral instruction favored interpretations that reinforced human responsibility. By locating transgression entirely within the human realm, they avoided speculative cosmology and maintained clear boundaries between divine and created beings. The Nephilim, under this reading, became symbols of human excess rather than products of cosmic breach. The coexistence of these views is evident in early Christian literature. Commentaries, sermons, and treatises preserve both strands, sometimes within the same work. The lack of immediate resolution suggests that the Nephilim were not central to doctrinal identity. They occupied a peripheral space where disagreement was tolerated. Over time, however, institutional pressures began to shape interpretation more decisively. As councils convened to define orthodoxy, questions about angels, embodiment, and the nature of evil demanded clarity. Interpretations that risked destabilizing these doctrines came under scrutiny. The Watcher framework, with its emphasis on angelic transgression, increasingly appeared problematic. A concrete anchor emerges in discussions about angelic nature. Early Christian theology emphasized angels as spiritual beings, incorporeal and obedient. Narratives suggesting physical reproduction conflicted with this understanding. As theological definitions solidified, interpretations that aligned with them gained favor. Human lineage explanations, by contrast, posed fewer doctrinal challenges. This process did not occur through formal prohibition alone. It unfolded gradually through preference, citation, and omission. Writers continued to acknowledge the existence of alternative views, but they increasingly framed them as speculative or uncertain. Over time, such views receded from mainstream teaching. The Nephilim thus became a test case for the limits of inherited cosmology. How much of the ancient worldview could be retained without compromising emerging doctrine? Different communities answered differently, but institutional consensus moved toward restraint. The more expansive interpretations survived at the margins rather than the center. This narrowing of acceptable readings reflects a broader pattern in early Christian thought. As the faith moved from diverse communities toward structured institutions, interpretive flexibility diminished. Texts and traditions were filtered through doctrinal priorities. The Nephilim, lacking clear relevance to salvation or practice, were not defended vigorously. Importantly, this process did not erase the tradition. References persisted and debates were remembered, but the energy surrounding the question diminished. The Nephilim became an inherited puzzle rather than an active concern. Their significance lay in what they revealed about interpretation itself. The patristic period thus marks a turning point. The Nephilim are no longer expanded as in Watcher traditions, nor tightly contained as in rabbinic literature. Instead, they are weighed and selectively retained. Some elements are absorbed, others are set aside. This selective inheritance demonstrates the shaping power of institutional theology. Interpretation is guided not only by text, but by the needs of doctrine. The Nephilim's fate within Christian thought reflects this reality. What could not be harmonized was not always rejected outright, but quietly marginalized. By the end of this phase, the Nephilim occupy an ambiguous position. They are acknowledged as part of the scriptural record, yet rarely emphasized. Their story is known but not developed. The question they raise remains unresolved, but it is no longer pressing. This unresolved status prepares the final movement of the narrative. What is not settled by institutions often survives in silence. The Nephilim, having passed through expansion, containment, and doctrinal filtering, now linger at the edge of the record, remembered but largely left behind. As early Christian interpretation matured, the divergence surrounding the Nephilim gradually gave way to a pattern of selective emphasis. The issue was not resolved through a single decree or definitive ruling. Instead, it was shaped by repetition and neglect. Interpretations aligned with emerging doctrinal clarity continued to circulate. Others, while never formally condemned, were cited less frequently and with increasing caution. This process is visible in the way later patristic writers reference earlier authorities. Works that supported human-centered explanations were quoted approvingly. Those that preserved Watcher traditions were acknowledged but often qualified, framed as speculative or illustrative rather than authoritative. Over time, this hierarchy of citation established a practical boundary around acceptable interpretation. A concrete anchor appears in the treatment of non-canonical texts. Early Christian communities were aware of writings such as Enoch and related traditions. These texts were read, discussed, and sometimes valued for moral instruction. Yet as canon boundaries hardened, their influence narrowed. Without formal inclusion, their explanatory frameworks lost institutional support. The Nephilim, so central to those narratives, lost prominence by association. Councils addressing angelology and Christology further reinforced this narrowing. While the Nephilim themselves were not the focus, the theological assumptions underlying Watcher interpretations conflicted with emerging definitions of spiritual beings. Angels were increasingly understood as messengers and servants, not actors capable of autonomous rebellion through physical means. Interpretations incompatible with this understanding became difficult to sustain. This doctrinal consolidation altered how silence functioned within the tradition. Earlier ambiguity had invited exploration. Now it encouraged restraint. The absence of detail in Genesis was read as a limit rather than an invitation. The Nephilim remained part of the text, but their interpretive expansion was no longer pursued. The effect of this shift can be seen in homiletic literature. Sermons rarely linger on the Nephilim. When mentioned, they serve as brief examples rather than subjects of inquiry. Moral lessons focus on human behavior, obedience, and humility. The giants recede into the background, their narrative potential left unused. This retreat does not indicate embarrassment or denial. It reflects prioritization. Early Christian communities were engaged with questions of salvation, incarnation, and ecclesial order. The Nephilim, lacking direct relevance to these concerns, were not central. Their story did not disappear, it simply ceased to develop. The divergence that once characterized early Christian engagement thus resolves into a pattern of quiet abandonment. Interpretive paths that could not be harmonized with institutional theology were neither embraced nor aggressively rejected. They were allowed to fade. This fading illustrates the power of institutional focus. What is taught repeatedly becomes central. What is left unspoken becomes peripheral. The Nephilim, once expanded into detailed narratives, now survive primarily as textual artifacts. Their presence is acknowledged, but their implications are left unexplored. By this stage, the Nephilim have undergone a significant transformation. They began as a restrained term in the primeval record. They were expanded into agents of cosmic disorder. They were contained by legal tradition. They were debated within early Christian thought. Now, they persist as unresolved remnants within an inherited text. This persistence is subtle. The Nephilim are not erased. They remain in Scripture, untranslated or lightly glossed. Their ambiguity endures. Yet without institutional momentum, the question they pose loses urgency. Silence returns not as mystery but as margin. This outcome prepares the ground for the final phase of the narrative. What institutions leave behind often reemerges in different contexts, shaped by new priorities. The Nephilim, having passed through theological filtration, stand as an example of how ancient questions can remain present yet dormant. As this chapter closes, the listener encounters a tradition that has chosen coherence over completeness. The Nephilim are acknowledged, weighed, and set aside. Their story does not end. It simply stops being pursued. The unresolved is carried forward quietly, waiting beyond the boundaries of doctrine for renewed attention. The record, when approached at its conclusion, offers no resolution to the question it first introduced so briefly. The Nephilim remain named but undefined, present yet elusive. After centuries of transmission, interpretation, and institutional engagement, the term still resists enclosure. This resistance is not the result of neglect or failure, but of preservation. The ambiguity has endured because it was never removed. Across the textual history, the Nephilim function less as a subject than as a boundary marker. They appear at moments where order is tested, language strains, and explanation gives way to acknowledgement. The record does not attempt to integrate them fully into any system. Instead, it allows them to remain at the edge of what is articulated, signaling disruption without specifying form. This role becomes clearer when the full arc of interpretation is held together. The primeval narrative introduced the Nephilim without genealogy or action. Later traditions expanded them into agents of devastation. Historical texts reframed them as echoes within human conflict. Royal language absorbed their memory into symbolic greatness. Translation emphasized physicality. Rabbinic literature contained the question. Early Christian thought debated and then set it aside. At no point was the term erased. At no point was it finally resolved. A concrete anchor appears in the stability of the Genesis text itself. Despite layers of commentary and translation, the original passage remains unchanged. The Nephilim are still mentioned only briefly. No explanatory clause has been added. No editorial correction has been made. The restraint of the original record persists through centuries of transmission, standing in contrast to the abundance of interpretation surrounding it. This persistence suggests that the ambiguity itself has value. The Nephilim occupy a space that cannot be easily assimilated into genealogy, law, or doctrine. They are not ancestors, commandments, or dogma. They are a reminder that the record acknowledges realities it does not exhaustively explain. In this way, the Nephilim function as a limit case for textual authority. The diversity of interpretations does not cancel one another out. Instead, they accumulate. Each phase reframed the Nephilim according to its needs, yet none fully displaced earlier meanings. Cosmic transgression, social disorder, political symbolism, and theological caution coexist within the tradition. The Nephilim become a point where these layers intersect without collapsing into a single narrative. This layered reception transforms the question itself into a historical phenomenon. The persistence of disagreement, reinterpretation, and restraint becomes part of what the Nephilim signify. They are not only an ancient problem, they are a record of how communities respond to uncertainty. Each response reveals more about the interpreter than about the term. The record's refusal to conclude the matter is consistent with its broader character. Scripture often preserves tension rather than resolving it. Genealogies leave gaps. Laws assume interpretation. Narratives end without explanation. The Nephilim belong to this pattern. Their ambiguity is not an oversight, but a feature of a text that values transmission over closure. A further anchor lies in the way later readers continue to return to the same brief verses. Despite centuries of commentary, the point of departure remains unchanged. The Genesis passage does not expand under scrutiny. It remains compact, resistant to overreading. This resistance draws attention back to the text itself, reminding the reader that interpretation has limits. The Nephilim, then, are best understood not as a solved riddle, but as a preserved problem. They mark the boundary between what the record states and what it leaves unsaid. Their presence challenges interpreters to recognize the difference between explanation and speculation, between memory and invention. This does not render interpretation futile. On the contrary, the history of engagement demonstrates its necessity. Each tradition sought to account for the Nephilim in ways consistent with its worldview. These efforts shaped theology, law, and narrative memory. The unresolved nature of the term did not hinder interpretation, it generated it. Yet the record itself remains unchanged by these efforts. The Nephilim are still introduced without elaboration, situated between human multiplication and divine judgment. They still appear briefly and then vanish. The silence that surrounds them has not been filled by the text, only by its readers. This enduring silence serves as a corrective. It reminds later audiences that not every named reality is meant to be categorized. Some function as indicators rather than entities. The Nephilim point to disruption, boundary crossing, and disorder without specifying mechanism. They signal that something in the world has gone wrong, not how it happened in detail. As the narrative draws toward its close, the Nephilim return to where they began, within the record, not beyond it. They are neither myth fully embraced nor error corrected. They are preserved as part of the textual inheritance, carrying with them the weight of unanswered questions. The persistence of the question becomes its own conclusion. The Nephilim endure because the record allows them to. Their unresolved status reflects a broader commitment to preserving complexity rather than simplifying it. The text does not demand certainty where it has not provided it. In this final movement, the record does not offer synthesis in the form of resolution. Instead, it offers continuity. The Nephilim remain named, remembered, and unresolved, anchored in the text, shaped by history and resistant to final classification. The unresolved character of the Nephilim becomes most apparent when the record is read without the pressure to conclude. Stripped of later urgency, the text reveals a pattern that repeats across its history. Moments of disruption are acknowledged, framed, and then allowed to remain partially opaque. The Nephilim belong to this pattern. Their function is not to provide information, but to signal a threshold where explanation recedes. Throughout the centuries, interpreters have attempted to move past this threshold. Each effort has produced structure, cosmic hierarchies, legal cautions, political symbolism, doctrinal limits. Yet none of these structures fully contains the term. What remains consistent is not any particular explanation, but the persistence of the problem itself. The Nephilim endure as a reminder that the record accommodates uncertainty without dissolving into it. A concrete anchor lies in the repeated return to language of boundary. Whether framed as heavenly transgression, social collapse, excessive power, or interpretive danger, The Nephilim consistently appear where limits are tested. They are present when distinctions blur and order requires reaffirmation. This recurring placement suggests that their primary role is structural rather than descriptive. The refusal to classify them definitively preserves the integrity of the text. A fully explained Nephilim would close the narrative. An unresolved one keeps it open. This openness does not invite endless speculation within the record itself. Instead, it marks the point at which the text hands responsibility back to the reader, not to invent, but to recognize restraint. Historical institutions responded differently to this handover. Some expanded the narrative to satisfy ethical or cosmic concerns. Others restricted interpretation to protect law and doctrine. Still others absorbed the language into political memory. None of these responses replaced the original passage. They surrounded it, sometimes densely, sometimes cautiously, but never altered its core. The endurance of the Nephilim across translation further reinforces this point. Words change languages, associations shift, yet the term remains resistant to exhaustion. Each linguistic tradition highlights different facets, size, strength, reputation, without eliminating ambiguity. Translation preserves the problem even as it reframes it. This persistence reshapes how the Nephilim are ultimately understood. They cease to function as a question-demanding answer and become a feature of the record's texture. Like other unresolved elements, they teach by remaining incomplete. They demonstrate that the text is not a catalog of explanations, but a preserved witness to complexity. The historical accumulation of interpretations becomes part of the story. The Nephilim are not only ancient figures, they are a record of interpretive behavior. How communities respond to them reveals priorities, anxieties, and boundaries. The question endures because it continues to serve this reflective function. In this sense, the Nephilim are less about what happened than about how meaning is managed. They show how texts carry forward unresolved material without collapsing. They illustrate how authority can coexist with ambiguity. The record remains authoritative not because it answers every question, but because it preserves what it chooses not to answer. As the final chapter settles, attention returns to the original posture of the text. The Nephilim are named once, placed carefully, and left without comment. Everything that follows, expansion, containment, adaptation, flows from that choice. The silence is not accidental, it is the point. The record closes where it began, not by resolving the Nephilim, but by preserving them. They remain at the edge of understanding, neither central nor dismissed. Their ambiguity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be recognized. In this way, the Nephilim fulfill their final role. They stand as a lasting marker of disruption, memory, and restraint. Named, remembered, and unresolved, they remain exactly where the record placed them, quietly present, historically active, and deliberately unfinished.